Welcome to Elevating Consciousness, the podcast that brings you mind-expansive conversations into the heart of what matters most. I'm your host, Artem, and our guest today is Cadell Last. Cadell is an anthropologist, philosopher, and founder of Philosophy Portal, an online educational platform opening space for the next generation of philosophical thought. After developing a strong grounding in evolutionary anthropology and biology, he began a deep study of philosophies of phenomenology and psychoanalysis, which opened him to fresh perspectives and helped him better navigate some of life's most challenging aspects. Today, his work explores biocultural evolution, mind-matter relation, and speculative futures. He's the author of Global Brain Singularity and Systems and Subjects, co-author of Sex, Masculinity, God, as well as lead editor of community anthologies Enter the Alien and Abyssal Arrows. I find Cadell does an amazing job of integrating various fields and thinks in very deep ways about history, the present, and the future. And I found engaging with his thought to be expansive to my own perspective, and I hope you find the same. Enjoy. Cadell Last, welcome to the show.
Yo, happy to be here. Nice to meet you, Artem.
Yeah, likewise. I'd love to set some context before we dive in. In recent years, I feel increasingly called to go deeper into philosophy. And, although with so many writings and thinkers, I'm not always sure where to start. I've also had this intuition for a while that philosophy is something that is better explored in a community and in dialogue, not just in individual study sessions. And recently I've been seeing your name popping up in the liminal web, and I later discovered your online educational platform, Philosophy Portal. And I've been meaning to participate, although most of the live sessions don't quite work with my schedule. Nonetheless, I'm very intrigued by the prospect of doing philosophy in community, and I'm happy I've run across your work. I've also had a chance to read your book, Global Brain Singularity, which by no means was an easy read. And I won't pretend I understood all of it, but there were many parts there that were highly engaging and thought-provoking. And I'd love to dive deeper into some of those ideas and what you're doing at Philosophy Portal. But maybe you can start by sharing how you got into philosophy in the first place and provide a brief overview of your work for those who are new to you.
Sure. Well, first, I just appreciate you taking the time to read Global Brain Singularity. That was a labor of love that all told took me about, let's say, 6 or 7 years to really complete. And there was also a long personal struggle in that process that led to a lot of weird inner transformations in the book itself. And it's actually in writing that book that I came to philosophy. So I think I should situate my coming to philosophy in the context of writing Global Brain Singularity. I was trained in the evolutionary sciences, but more importantly, I chose the evolutionary sciences because I was first blown away by the human condition. There was around the age of 18 or 19, coming into sort of my own intellectual maturity, a certain question about the human condition stuck out to me. And that question was basically the mystery of what we are, considering how unique we are in the context of everything else. I always sort of had the perspective that the human being was fundamentally different from all other organisms, as well as different from the rest of physical nature. And of course, the rest of physical nature, as far as we know, we don't see or have no other intelligent species or civilization to compare ourselves to or to contrast ourselves to. So if you're an astrophysicist, for example, you can do science, so to speak, because you can compare and contrast galaxies with other galaxies. But if you're an anthropologist and you're interested in the human being, you can't compare our species with another intelligent species and do some sort of compare and contrast analysis. Like, the first sort of thought experiment that blew my mind away was, wouldn't it be cool if there was like 20 or 30 different intelligent species and civilizations, and you could do some sort of meta-analysis of all these different civilizations and intelligences? And just the fact that we couldn't do that almost upset me. and anyway, long story short, I settled with studying chimpanzees originally. So that was like the closest I could get was the logic for my young mind, in any case. But that sort of led to that perplexity of the human difference. That ultimately led me to wondering about the future of the human species, and specifically the future of the human species in the context of science, being that science gained its sort of historical cultural credibility on the basis of its predictive capacities. So, for example, like the early scientists blew other people away in regards to the precision with which they could predict, let's say, a shooting comet. Like they could predict the day and the time. You look at that area of the sky and you'll see a shooting comet. And this blew people away. And the more I studied science, the more I studied the history of science, the more I realized that this capacity to predict had been imported into the social sciences and had been the ground of, for example, say a scientific study of sociology, or, a scientific study of history. And like the early sociologists in the 19th century were doing these things like Marx and Durkheim and Weber. But it kind of failed, meaning that the attempt to apply the predictive powers of science to human society and human civilization, we kind of reach a breakdown of our predictive capacities. And that's, of course, well known today. And in the last few decades, science has become more familiar with and integrating with discourses of chaos, discourses of complexity, and all of those fields related to complexity science and chaos theory. They are obviously much more attuned to nonlinear models and the breakdown of prediction horizons and the irreducibility of uncertainty. And so I found myself studying in a doctorate in complexity science, and specifically complexity science that was organized within an interdisciplinary field. And long story short, I had the great privilege of 4 or 5 years of open-ended research and study to complete Global Brain Singularity, my thesis. And what really was motivating me there was what people in the sciences were saying about the technological singularity. And specifically the technological singularity being this idea that even if we can't predict the future of human society, we can predict the evolution of computation. And we can predict the future of computation on an exponential model, on an exponential curve. And that if this was sort of accurately tracking development, that the world in 2050 was going to look nothing like the world in 2000. And that very much resonated and spoke to me. I didn't know what the world in 2050 was going to look like. I didn't know how much to trust the predictions that were being generated by people in the technological singularity field, but it interested me anthropologically. And so as I had a lot of free time, a lot of freedom in general to develop my own research ideas for Global Brain Singularity, I reached the limits of my capacity to think these things with just science. And so, again, long story short, that's how I found myself drawn to philosophy. And I found myself drawn to philosophy because I found in philosophy a foundation in phenomenology, a foundation in logic, and a foundation in psychoanalysis, which I think we're going to need as we approach a very different technological universe. So I see the sciences as developing a totally new technological infrastructure for civilization, but potentially ill-equipped at the current time to account for the phenomenological, logical, and psychoanalytic dimensions of this process.
Yeah. And I really appreciate, thinkers that are able to kind of tap into science and also philosophy, and kind of it seems like philosophy is always at play. There's always some kind of a philosophy that's at play, even for a scientist, even approaching some kind of an experiment. There's always their first person experience. There's always that subjectivity that's playing into it. There's always biases, and I think that's what you're kind of speaking to, is like there's the psychoanalysis, there's the unconscious motives and things that are there. Why are they even doing the experiments that they're doing? Which experiments did they decide to do? And what things are they looking for? So it's interesting how that's always there. And, obviously this is becoming a bigger conversation now than it was, but there are still some people that are like, oh no, like, like somehow that science could be like separated from everything else.
No, exactly. So the whole idea that science can be separated from unconscious motivations and history in general, that science is it not itself historical, is fundamentally problematic, and it's probably generated from a foundation in science that comes from a reductive base, and, as is well known, a type of physics envy. And this was imported into the early attempts at sociology. Like I mentioned, the Durkheims, the Webers, the Marxes. But ultimately, science has to reconcile with itself as a historical process. And science has to reconcile with the unconscious mind. And so when you combine, and so basically the ground shifts. The ground shifts from a ground that's based on a reductive materialism to a ground that has to reconcile with history and unconscious mental processes. And history and unconscious mental processes become the container or field within which science is working. And I don't think that we can relativize science. I think that science is universal in the sense that there are consequences for scientific activity that affect all human beings universally, like, and here I'm talking about phenomena like genetic engineering or artificial intelligence or various other technological products. The computers we're using right now to facilitate this conversation, that's not relative to a certain cultural horizon. All humans and all cultures can use this stuff. And so there's a unique power that's explored, and there's a unique power that's unleashed with the scientific revolution. But ultimately, and I think this is true to many of the great scientists who have wrestled with science and have come to confront the human phenomena, that ultimately we have to confront ourselves. Ultimately, we have to confront the nature of human society and, let's say, a historical destiny or a historical horizon. In my doctoral thesis, the subtitle is the dialectical horizon of human history. We have to reconcile ourselves with confronting this horizon, which is ultimately a horizon constituted by billions of different forms of human subjectivity.
Yeah, so there's many ways we could kind of take this conversation, and there's a lot more to explore, and actually in the idea of global brain singularity. But I guess maybe we can look at some of the thinkers that are have been most influential to you. And I think the four philosophers I hear you speak most of, and that you spoke about in Global Brain Singularity, is Plato, Hegel, Lacan, and Zizek. Can you speak to the main ideas you take from each of these thinkers and how you integrate and build on them?
Yeah, totally. So the reason why in Global Brain Singularity, there's a paper called A Reflective Note for Dialectical Thinkers, where I sort of offer a foundational meta-ontology for the way I'm thinking within philosophy. And that sort of meta-ontology is comprised of the four thinkers you just named. And the reason why, even also like the tool of meta-ontology here is trying to build a structure of thought that is linked to a different thinker in different, let's say, historical epochs. So Plato for the ancient world, Hegel for the modern world, Lacan for the postmodern world, and Zizek for what I would call something like a transmodernity or something transcending modernity. Now, this as a tool, this as an exercise, I think is important for us as growing philosophers. What that means is that you don't have to identify with those four thinkers, but that you can use this to develop your own meta-ontology. So the principle would just be that if there's a thinker that you think is foundational in the ancient world, it doesn't have to be Plato, it could be someone totally different from a totally different tradition. And then if you can build with that thinker into the modern world, and then build with that thinker into the postmodern world, and then build with that thinker into something that's transcending the modern world, then you have something like a meta-ontology that's robust, that doesn't leave out any significant dimension of the historical process. As it relates to what I'm trying to do with that specific meta-ontology, is that I see a conversation between those four thinkers that is fundamentally connected retroactively. Meaning that, of course, Plato didn't engage with Hegel. Of course, Plato didn't engage with Lacan or Zizek. But Hegel is fundamentally engaging with Plato. And Lacan is fundamentally engaging with Hegel. And Zizek is fundamentally engaging with Lacan. And so there's a conversation there that gets developed over history. And that conversation itself makes each of those thinkers more robust retroactively. So in other words, I'm saying that Plato on his own is, to me, like, even, for example, my partner's reading Plato right now. And she's introducing herself to philosophy for the first time. And she's reading Plato, and she's like, I disagree with most of the things Plato's saying. You know, her first contact with Plato is she doesn't like Plato. But then and she's saying that he's stuck in her criticism of Plato is that Plato's stuck in a philosophical fantasy. But I said, but I think that's so interesting, because I told her, when you read how Lacan thinks about Plato, he's analyzing Plato as an unconscious philosophical fantasy. And so that's interesting. And so then that gets a new dimension to Plato. So I'm just trying to use that as a practical example of how, when you develop a meta-ontology like this, older thinkers that might have, lost a certain edge for our time can get a new retroactive perspective based on this meta-ontological lineage that you can construct. So there's a lot of potential here. But why starting with Plato is that Plato is the foundation for what becomes Western philosophy and Western religion. And so whether or not we identify with Plato and what he actually thought, I think we have to respect the concrete results of Plato's philosophy, meaning that it had an outsized impact on what was practically being built in both the Greek world and the Roman world, and ultimately what has come to be known as the Western world. And this has had an outsized impact on mathematics, not just mathematics and geometry and logical thinking, but also sexuality and love and romance and social life. So there's a remarkable breadth and depth to Plato's thinking that seems to cover everything from mathematics to sexuality and everything in between. And that's an impressive effort, and that is an example of a foundational thinker for something like a civilizational project. Why that's an interesting intersection with Hegel is because Hegel is able, in my opinion, to historicize Plato. When we think about Plato, we usually think about the eternal ideas, we usually think about the eternal forms. And the main criticism of Platonist thinking is usually that you can get caught in eternal ideas, or you can get caught in eternal forms and basically enter into a process of disembodiment. And I think that this gets rectified with Hegel, because Hegel is able to historicize Plato. That's my claim. And with historicizing Plato, what that means is that we don't just end up in a sort of embodied relativity, but rather we have to think the eternal idea as a historical process. And that's something that I think Hegel is really useful for. And I think that's actually the core of Hegel, is that he's thinking the intersection between eternity and history. And this is a very powerful explosion that occurs and goes on to influence a lot, I think, of what we call modern philosophy, including Marx, including Nietzsche, including Heidegger, including Deleuze. And when I mention those thinkers in particular, I'm not saying that those thinkers agree with Hegel. I'm saying that those thinkers have been profoundly influenced by Hegel, and they've differentiated from Hegel, but they have nevertheless tarried with Hegel deeply. And so I think that that's important to note. Then with Lacan, what's important is that we get the psychoanalysis of philosophy. So many times in the narratives, we think that with Hegel, it's almost like philosophy begins and ends, and it's almost like he's the last philosopher. With Lacan, we get sort of almost like a resurrection of the philosophical project in a weird way, because we're entering into a new way of thinking about philosophy from the standpoint of the unconscious as intelligent, the unconscious that thinks and speaks. And that, so for example, just like I was giving the example of my partner saying, look, Plato's in a philosophical fantasy. This doesn't have any implications for real political problems. And Lacan would say, well, precisely, there's the unconscious at work at the very foundation of philosophy itself. And so this is a very useful activity. And Lacan himself does this throughout his career. He psychoanalyzes Descartes and saying that, like, for example, at the ground of Cartesian rationality, you have this explosion of madness, right? Like, and this explosion of madness where Descartes is doubting everything, and he's actually playing with the idea that he's been deceived by God. Right. And so there's this explosion of insanity at the ground of what we consider to be a very rational cognitive process. And so Lacan's doing this all the time. And then finally with Zizek, and I think that before I close, I think it's very important that if you do engage this sort of meta-ontological project, or if you're interested in philosophy in general, it's very important to be in contact with a living philosopher. Don't just engage with dead philosophers. It's very important to have some contact with a living philosopher. And I think the reason why that's important is because philosophy is almost like eternity refreshing itself in every historical generation. So every historical generation has to refresh its thought of the absolute. And I think that for me, Zizek spoke to me in a deep way. And Zizek, his performativity spoke to me, and also the way in which he engaged history spoke to me. And the way I've come to understand that is that I see Zizek as an explosion in the aftermath of the Cold War. So the Cold War ends, and we find ourselves no longer in a battle between capitalism and communism, but in a universal capitalism. And the common doxa is that we've transcended world historical ideological conflict. The main ideological conflict between capitalism and communism is over. And now we can just have a rational, liberal, secular society. But Zizek is saying ideology is here even more pervasive than ever. And ideology functions unconsciously to bring in the Lacanian dimension, the psychoanalytic dimension, and that we enjoy our ideology, meaning that people like their ideology. When we usually say, like, we usually are critical of ideology, we're usually saying that ideology is something to be deconstructed. But Zizek is saying even the deconstructionists, they love their ideology. They love the deconstructive ideology. They don't want to let that go, right? So there's something really profound in that gesture. And also Zizek has always used, and I think this is a very important thing to develop as a thinker, Zizek has always engaged world historical crisis. And he has thought with world historical crisis. So for example, when 9/11 occurred, he was the first person to write a big book about it. When the 2008 financial collapse happened, he was writing a book about it. When coronavirus occurred, he was writing a book about it. So when world historical crisis breaks out, that's the time for philosophy to get its hands dirty, so to speak. And that's a really important dimension, which I think Ivy League, elite, university philosophy sometimes takes a distance from. Like, we're just in the idea, reflecting on Plato's dialogues. We don't have time to think about coronavirus. We don't have time to think about 9/11. We don't have time to think about the 2008 financial crisis. I think, no. I think we need to think about these dimensions. And what is philosophy good for if it's not thinking about these world historical ruptures, which, to bring the point full circle, is that precisely those crises can't be predicted by science. They disrupt normal processes. They disrupt our world. Nobody knew that coronavirus was going to happen. Nobody knew that 9/11 was going to happen. These are things that disturb us. They invade us almost. So I think that's where philosophy becomes most actual and most real.
Yeah, I really appreciate this bit that you just, all this that you shared, and there's so many pieces there. I want to just kind of double tap on a couple of things and kind of scaffold that. You spoke about Plato kind of being this foundational thinker and foundational for Western philosophy and religion, and then Hegel kind of comes in and he takes Plato's idea of the eternal and turns them into process. Like he puts them into history. How do these ideas play out in history? And and then you mentioned Lacan, psychoanalyzing past philosophers. Like, what was happening in each of these philosophers' minds as they're like coming to these thoughts and these ideas. And then Zizek, he's somebody who also is very engaged in history. And, the thing you spoke about, which is really interesting, that he will talk about world historical crisis and actually engage with what is really important, where a lot of times like academic philosophy is like, it's just philosophizing and not thinking about what's happening. I think what else is really interesting, and I've thought about this before, how what's really interesting about philosophy is that you have people that came before us and that have, lived 100 years, 80 years, 70 years, and they've spent that life thinking deeply about things and then writing them down. And now we have all their thoughts. So now we're kind of getting an advantage in a sense that there's been all these people that came before us that spent hours and years and decades thinking about these things, and we could kind of build on that. But the piece that you also say is that you can take different ideas and kind of see you kind of filter one thinker through another thinker's ideas, and there's just this kind of like almost like fractal building on philosophies. And yeah, it's the other piece that you said that's I don't think I've heard before, but was really interesting is that you need to be in contact with a living philosopher. So like, Plato, Hegel, and Lacan, they're dead. Zizek is a modern day philosopher that's still alive right now. A lot of times people say that, you should only read old books, like only read old books because they stood the test of time. But it's interesting how you bring in this piece. Like, no, there's something about somebody living in these days and times, dealing with what's happening now, that's also important to this kind of philosophical process.
Absolutely. I think it's a bit of both. I also resonate with people who, for example, don't want to read every book that comes out on the New York bestsellers list. Like I myself don't. I actually don't read any popular books in general. Yeah. I don't really pay attention to the news that much in general. I'm mostly reading old dead philosophers. But I also think it's important to connect it to a living philosopher or just a living scientist in general. Like, so for example, when I came into the evolutionary sciences, I was studying Richard Dawkins. I was hugely influenced by Richard Dawkins when I was 19. And it was through Richard Dawkins that I started to read Charles Darwin. And so we shouldn't underestimate the power of a living thinker, and a living thinker to introduce people to dead thinkers. Like, for example, how many people were influenced by Jordan Peterson and then started to read Carl Jung?
Yeah.
Right? Like this is a real thing that goes on. And I think that we should understand this process about how the living is connected to the dead. And I think we should also pay attention to really engaging universality in both dimensions. Like we should be engaging universality of the greatest books ever written, and we should be engaging universality in terms of thinkers who are moving discourse on a universal level. So it doesn't matter if you disagree with Jordan Peterson or you disagree with Slavoj Žižek as historical performativity. You can't deny that they are universally impactful discursively. Like Peterson is universally impactful, Zizek is universally impactful, Richard Dawkins is universally impactful. And I think we should wrestle with these thinkers. We shouldn't reduce these thinkers to memes. We should read their books. We should engage their ideas. And that doesn't mean we have to agree with them. It just means that we should challenge ourselves and raise ourselves to thinking universally.
Yeah, so it's important to engage with such thinkers because they have such reach. So that's representing something that's happening in the human mind. That the fact that why are we paying attention to these specific thinkers? There's a reason for there to be there. So you might not agree with those thinkers, but for some reason, as a collective, we seem to be paying attention to what they're speaking about.
Absolutely. It's too easy to just negate or just deconstruct a thinker who has a universal import. The number of times that I've heard someone just casually dismiss Richard Dawkins, or someone just casually dismiss a thinker like Jordan Peterson, or casually dismiss a thinker like Slavoj Žižek. And of course, there are many others. There are many universal thinkers. But the number of times I've heard people casually dismiss those thinkers without actually having read their books or without actually having really battled with their ideas deeply. And you can tell the difference between someone who has and someone who hasn't. Like, and you're in here, like, I remember when I was in my early 20s, reading The Selfish Gene cover to cover, reading The Ancestor's Tale cover to cover, reading Maps of Meaning, reading, Less Than Nothing or The Sublime Object of Ideology. You have to really do the work before you can critique or deconstruct or negate these thinkers. And just seeing like a clip on YouTube or just seeing a short and then sort of making up your mind about, this presumption that you're such a great thinker already. Like this is how we fool ourselves. I think And once you start studying philosophy, you realize that everyone unconsciously thinks they're a philosopher, and everyone unconsciously thinks their ideas are the best ideas, and so all of this gets more complex, I think, when you start reading philosophy.
Yeah, this is a huge point. Like, it's just so easy to see a clip of Jordan Peterson. I don't like what he's saying, but that's very different than to actually grapple with his ideas. And often I see people comment on, like, the most kind of extreme version of somebody or something, and just kind of focus on that and not see what are kind of the deeper ideas that are underneath, and those are not contended with. So, I think it's important to bring in dialectical thinking, because like you mentioned, that whole kind of chapter was like for dialectical thinkers. I really appreciate it. That was one of my. It was a challenging one, but that was one of the favorite ones that I read in GBS. I'm gonna call Global Brain Singularity GBS. But yeah, why do you feel it's important for us to learn how to think dialectically? How does that play into your philosophy?
So the first thing is that dialectics is not formally taught at our contemporary universities. Dialectics is, in that sense, an overlooked discipline, but at the same time, it's an ancient discipline that is functioning at the foundation of some of the greatest thinkers who ever lived. Plato was a dialectician. The reason why Plato was able to write the types of books and the types of texts he was writing was because he was using the dialectical logic.
Can you real quick just explain what that is? Because not everybody might know what that dialectical thinking is.
Absolutely. So dialectics in its shortest form is, let's say, working with the logic of opposition and working with the logic of contradiction, and ultimately attempting to derive a positive result from that opposition and that contradiction. So usually when we think about opposition, or usually when we think about contradiction, we think about it as negative. We think about it as something almost to avoid, even something to be fearful of. But I think with dialectics, you're trying to train yourself to bring, like, so for example, let's say you're somebody who has a spontaneous, unconscious opposition to someone like Jordan Peterson or Richard Dawkins or Slavoj Žižek. Dialectics would train you to bring that opposition into attention within your own mind. That there's something interesting, there's something important in your own unconscious, spontaneous opposition to that individual or that form of thinking. And in wrestling with that opposition, in playing with that opposition, in playing with that as a self-contradiction, you might be able to think something that you otherwise wouldn't be able to think. And that's the crucial thing, is that dialectics is a method for thinking where you could potentially think something different from what you currently think. So I often talk about my introduction to dialectics in the context of being dissatisfied with a form of thinking that I would call worldview thinking. Worldview thinking is this idea that I have a worldview and you have a worldview, and that there's a difference between our worldviews. And usually there's this tension between two people where you're trying to convert someone, almost like a religious conversion, to your worldview. And I think this is a relic from religious types of engagement with the world, where you're saying, like, I'm a Christian, or I'm an Islamist, or I'm a Buddhist, or I'm a Hindu. But this also appears in science, where you could say, I'm a cognitive behavioral therapist, or you could say, I'm a evolutionary biologist, or you could say I'm a quantum physicist, right? These are all worldviews that people walk around with. And in the context of neoliberal capitalism, because we shouldn't forget the fact that we're in that religion, that people build their careers out of these worldviews. People build their careers as a cognitive behavioral therapist or a quantum physicist or an evolutionary biologist. And so at the doctoral program I was studying in, my doctoral supervisor, who's a brilliant man and an evolutionary scientist, I would say a world expert in evolutionary science, one of his projects was that he wanted to build an evolutionary worldview that would reconcile differences between science and religion. And I just didn't see that as a compelling solution to the situation. And so, in this dissatisfaction with worldview thinking, I came to dialectical thinking. And I found that to be a more useful approach to dealing with differences, to dealing with oppositions, to dealing with antagonisms, to dealing with contradiction, both in myself and in the other. And it has very concrete application. I think dialectics is useful for a marriage. I think dialectics is useful for a business. I think dialectics is useful for life. So it's not something that I'm just, hoarding off in my, academic study. It's something that I actively mobilize in my relationship, in my business, in my way of living.
Yeah. No, I really appreciate that, like seeing it in that way. And, there's a quote from Scott Fitzgerald who said the test of first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold two opposing ideas in mind and at the same time still retain the ability to function. And for me, dialectical thinking is like, I like to say it's like playing with paradox. And a long time ago, I had this intuition that life is inherently paradoxical, and you're running into just kind of the limits of linear reason, and there's just kind of just this unfolding and this, you can't wrap your mind around certain things in reality, and still we grapple with these different ideas. And just it's what usually happens is when we don't like somebody's ideas or they brush against our ideology or belief, we kind of want to move away from them. And it seems like we actually can learn a lot more from the people we disagree from. And, it's like when you agree too much, it's like even when I try to interview people, I try to look, where do I disagree, or where is something that maybe I have a belief that's different. And there's something in that that's interesting. Like I find when there's too much agreement in my relationships, it becomes stale. It's like it's almost like, I'm a very disagreeable person, actually, like just psychologically, like inherently very disagreeable. So it's like I almost thrive on that. Like, where is the conflict? Because there's something there in that conflict that needs to be illuminated.
Absolutely. So this is to me the zero level between, let's say, this is too much of a general statement, but it's kind of like the difference between a religious or a communitarian thinking. What I mean by a religious or a communitarian thinking is that we're forming a group based on a shared identity. So we're going to the same church, we're going to the same denomination, we're going to, or even again, this can also function in science and other areas, like where we're all bankers or we're all biologists, and then you look for shared, then you can find. It's also interesting studying, for example, anthropologically people within those shared belief systems, because I think humans naturally seek out differences at the same time. Like the most famous example would be in a shared religious institution, people disagreeing over very tiny differences in theological structure. Like, oh, you think the Holy Spirit only proceeds from the Father? I think the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son. And then we'll fight about it. Like, how could you only think it proceeds from the Father? It obviously also proceeds from the Son. You idiot. So but in evolutionary biology, you could have these disagreements with, like, oh, you believe in the origin of life hypothesis that is organized around the RNA hypothesis. Obviously, RNA could not have preceded DNA, or like you get these minor differences, and people go to war over them. But then the dialectics takes it, I think, to another level where you're finding disagreement between the worldviews themselves, and and consequently you have to learn to live in a way that at first seems like a form of homelessness, because we find home within these ideologies. We find, and like I'm saying about Zizek's theory of ideology, we enjoy that, you know? So we have to go against our own enjoyment in a weird way. We have to go against what we're cognitively predisposed to go towards in a certain way. But I think that is the stakes of thinking. And I think that when you look at the origin of fields, when you look at the origin of disciplines, what you find are people who were outside of fields. You find people who were outside of institutions. I always use the example of Darwin, Marx, Nietzsche, and Einstein. Because when you take those four thinkers, they're very different thinkers. They're in very different fields. They're in biology, physics, economy, and philosophy, even existential philosophy. And all of those thinkers, if you study the origin of their ideas, they came when they were homeless, so to speak. They were intellectually homeless, they were socially homeless, and they were thinking in the contradictions of life. They were thinking in the contradictions of what people identified with.
Yeah, it's definitely a capacity to be developed, being able to be in that, like, not knowing, in that confusion, and just, yeah, stepping out of ideology is definitely uncomfortable. So, there's a piece that I'm trying to understand, and you brought up Jordan Peterson a couple of times, and I actually wanted to speak about him also. So I appreciate that you brought him in, but you know, you write something about Zizek, and you write something about how Peterson and Zizek's viewpoints differ. And you write, there is a difference between placing myths before drives, which is what Peterson does, or drives before myths, which is what Zizek does. And you call this the Hegel-Lacanian standpoint, that drives mythify the real and not the other way around. And then you write, moreover, this is what strangely unites both Jordan Peterson and Richard Dawkins. Neither of them understand the importance of the Hegel-Lacanian standpoint. Can you explain what the Hegel-Lacanian standpoint is?
Yeah, so that's actually something that I've been thinking about in the last few months. And it's something I discovered in the last few, I discovered. It's something that I've been trying to develop in the last few months. And it's through a number of different things. One, it's that I'm always paying attention to the horizon of discursive antagonism. And I was listening to it was a very bad podcast between Peterson and Dawkins, where they totally talk past each other. Like, they don't understand each other at all.
Was that the only one that they ever did?
That's the only one they've done.
Yeah. Peterson interviewed Dawkins, yeah.
Peterson is inviting conversation with Dawkins,
yeah.
But Dawkins is not really interested in conversation with Peterson. But then even in the conversation between them, Peterson is he's acting very strange in a way that I could understand why Dawkins is kind of repelled. So I sympathize with both of them in a weird way on that level. But where they do find shared agreement, however, where they find shared agreement is in two main dimensions. They both dislike woke politics. They disagree with the solution to it, but they both dislike it. And so they have an affinity there. But they both have no clue how to interpret Lacan. And they had a bonding moment over it. Like, it was a very bad podcast in general. There was just they were missing each other. But when it came to their shared dislike of Lacan, they totally were vibing out. So that's sort of where the idea had its genesis. I was like, oh, they both kind of don't get that. And so I was interested in that. So, but you're telling me first, let me just describe the drives and the drives and the myth relationship, because I think that's really the core. Mm-hmm. That's really the core. The first thing to situate this drives myth relation, let me say first that the reason why Dawkins doesn't like Peterson is because Peterson is a mythological thinker. Peterson thinks in myth. Dawkins thinks this is untrue. Like Dawkins will say, that's not true. That's a myth. He'll say myths are fiction. He'll say myths are fiction, but it's not truth. And I'm interested in truth. And I'm interested in scientific truth. And Peterson will be, and then Peterson will be like, but myths are telling us something about the psychology of our minds. And so that's why Peterson did the biblical lecture series titled The Psychological Significance of Biblical Stories, which is saying that the myths, even if you don't believe they're literally true, they have a truth on the level of our psychology. They teach us something about our psychology, right? And so that's something where actually there's a Lacanian point there, which is that for Lacan, the true has the structure of a fiction. So in other words, when Dawkins is saying, for example, I'm not interested in myths. I just want scientific truth in itself, and myths are in the way of that. Lacan would say that's obfuscating the way in which the truth is revealed through the structure of fiction, and that you need the structure of fiction in order to explore the true. So there's less of a direct, there is an antagonism between the true and fiction, but it's more of a dialectical antagonism where actually you can get deeper into the truth by exploring fiction. Like, for example, the way in which we learn about ourselves by watching a movie. Like if you watch a movie, that's fiction. That didn't actually happen. But you can still learn about yourself through watching that. We can still, and we do learn about ourselves that way. We learn about ourselves through watching great dramas, and we learn about ourselves through listening to great music. We get to see a certain dramatization of the true. Nevertheless, the difference between drives and myth is crucial, because what I'm saying with drives mythify the real is that the mistake of putting myths before drive is that you never actually live. What that means is that when you think that a certain structure of myth is holding the truth in a, say, non-dialectical way, you end up just living and embodying in other people's drives. So what do I mean by that? It means, let's say you decide you're in some sort of existential breakdown, you're in some sort of existential discomfort, trouble, and you're just looking for a religion to help you with that existential anxiety, to help you with that ease. And you find a lot of satisfaction and you find a lot of solace in the Christian myths. Okay, but those myths are derived from other people's drives, right? So when you read biblical stories, you're reading stories of either things that happened and are exaggerated, or certain patterns of behavior that were repeated many times, and we learned from those repeated actions, and then they were turned into a story that could be passed down generationally. So those myths are, let's say, the concretization of other people's drives. They're no longer alive anymore, right? We can learn from those myths, but the drive comes first. So what I mean when the drive comes first is that, and it's very hard to live in a mode of the drives coming first. Like, let me give the example, like, let's say Jesus was actually a living person. When Jesus was actually a living person, Christianity didn't exist. Jesus didn't have Christianity. Jesus wasn't Christian. Jesus couldn't have been Christian. Jesus just had his drive. That's all he had. He had his drive. And he had the abyss of that experience of the cross. Right? And then we mythify it. Then we turn it into a story where we can build institutions around it, and we can build books, and we can write about it, and we can think about it. And there's something good with tarrying with myth. I'm not trying to say myth is unimportant. Myth is important. I'm just trying to say that so let me give an example. What does that mean for me? It means that I'm not for me personally, this is my own personal life choice. I'm not living my life in relationship to myths from the past. I could learn from myths from the past. And I could learn from myths that are on Netflix. I can learn from both. And myth and engaging with myth is helpful to learn about the true. But really, what I have is my drive. And more, if I am really committed to my drive, which is to engage in some sense with the abyss of my existence, and I'm really writing my own story and seeing the abyss as a positive thing, because I can't write my own story if it's already written, if it's already in a myth. Then I can't write my story. The story is already written. I just have my drive, and I'm true to my drive. The myth will happen retroactively, meaning whatever I build will be mythified. Now, here's the condition. Your drive will only be mythified if it's a socially real drive. And why is that? Because if it's a socially real drive, it means that it's going to be beneficial to other people. And so that story needs to be transmitted because other people could benefit from the real of your drive. And there's something unrepeatable about the real of your drive. No one else can have your drive. Only you have your drive. I can only live my life. You can only live your life. And those lives are irreducibly different. And that's good. The reason why it's good is because we can learn from different tensions. We can learn from different struggles. And we can write different stories. We can make even more interesting stories. And so the consequence of this ultimately is that I'm a little bit skeptical when people use myths as an identity. When people use myths as an identity, I think that it has a place and it has a use value. And even people can live out their lives in myths, and I'm not against that. I'm not in any way antagonistic to that. I'm just saying that for people who are interested in writing their own story, you have to realize that the drive comes first, the myths come later, and when you're identifying with myths, what you're identifying with are historical drives.
I'm trying to understand this a little more, like the way you're using drive, because like the way, for example, like the way I understand some of Jung's thought is, archetypes are what drive us. Like from Jung's viewpoint, it's like archetypes are these kind of primordial motifs, these things that exist in our psyche, and we kind of fall into these energetic patterns, and then we act out that pattern, right? So it would seem like from his, and maybe that's what's impacting Peterson's thinking. Like there's these archetypal motifs, and these are the things driving us. But it seems like you're seeing it in a different way.
So this comes down to a zero-level difference between Jung and Freud, which I have been studying and which I have invited into the portal. So, for example, I had someone who's an expert in archetypes and mythology come into an Edge session at the portal, and I love her thinking.
Yeah, I think I know who you're talking about too. Alyssa, isn't her name Alyssa?
Yeah, her name's Alyssa Polizzi, and she writes a blog called The Artemision.
Yeah.
So that's worth checking out for anyone. But in her session and in previous sessions, we've had this discussion about Jung and Freud. I don't think that we need to frame these two in a zero-level antagonism where we have to side with one over the other. And at the same time, there are real differences. And so we should engage those differences. In regards to this level of drive and myth, where I've come to, or where my current thinking is, and you correct me if I'm wrong, from your understanding, is that Jung's thinking about the unconscious is collective and historical, or collective and evolutionary, meaning it's about the collective unconscious of the evolutionary past of the species. Would you say that's correct? Or how would you understand it?
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah.
So the difference with Freud is that Freud's thinking about the unconscious is singular and present moment. So it's by singular and present moment, meaning it's your unconscious, it's my unconscious right now. So it's less about the collective species history, which has a real to it. So I'm not saying that this is a zero-level antagonism where one is right, one is wrong. I'm just saying that the collective historical unconscious of the species has a dimension to it, But what Freud's interested in is the singular present moment of the unconscious. And that's different than the collective species history of the unconscious. And so, the distinctions I'm making here on the level of drive and myth are inspired by this difference of thinking. But actually, it could accommodate both ways of thinking. It just depends on what accent you want to put on it. Because the collective history of the species and the myths that are there have a real to it. And like I said, we can learn from them. But also, the singularity of your existence and the present moment of your existence also has a real to it. And you can also learn from that. But they're just different ways of learning. And they might actually lend themselves to different psychological dispositions, or they could lend themselves to what someone needs at different moments in their life. At a certain moment in your life, you might need to connect to the whole species history, and you might need to connect to all the myths that the species has ever produced. And at another moment of your life, you might need to learn about what does my singularity in the present moment of my life, what am I wrestling with right now? And so I would say that that's why Jung goes in a more, like, Jung has objectively influenced more people in spirituality and mythology and religion and that dimension of life. And Freud has influenced and impacted, I think, more in actual analytic practice, like in the actual clinic. I think Freud has had a bigger impact. So I think there are two different ways of approaching the unconscious, but I don't think that they are in a zero sum competition. Even if in the actuality of their tension and in also people's spontaneous identifications now, sometimes it can appear that way.
Yeah, well, that's really helpful. You unpacking kind of Jung's and Freud's perspective, and could see the dialectical thinking there coming in again. And so, we kind of unpacked all these different thinkers that kind of play into your philosophy. Maybe it would be more helpful to speak a little bit more about global brain singularity theory. My understanding, this is not like a theory you came up with. It's something that there's many thinkers thinking about, and you're contributing to it. So, what are your unique contributions to it? And, how is global brain singularity theory different than the traditional technological singularity vision of, say, Ray Kurzweil?
Great question. And yeah, that's totally how I understand it. So first, this tradition has its origin in the idea of the technological singularity. And the origin of the idea of the technological singularity definitely has its roots in more physics and more engineering or technologically minded individuals. That's where the theory originated, and it only has its basis in the ideas around what the founders of computation and the fields of computation recognized in the potential future evolution of computation. And you can even trace this back to the early 20th century or even the late 19th century. Like in the late 19th century and early 20th century, you can find thinkers that were extrapolating technological progress or extrapolating technological evolution towards what they would call a singularity. And what that means, a singularity, is where the prediction horizon breaks down, where we can no longer say what's going to happen after that. And this is derived from physics and mathematics first. Mathematics first, and then physics, and then technology. And it goes in that order. I think that's important. So in mathematics, a singularity is where you basically reach infinity. In physics, you reach a black hole. And in technological singularity theory, it's where you reach the limit. You could say it's where you reach the limit of human cognition. So infinity, black hole, limit of human cognition. And sort of discovered in that order. Now, this becomes more concrete when we see that the technological capacities for technological singularity are within our lifetimes. And that's something that really comes out of a suite of thinkers who birthed artificial intelligence, but really popularized and turned mainstream by Ray Kurzweil and his thinking on that. And of course, he's still alive and he's still writing books. He actually just produced another book. He just published another book this year on the topic of the technological singularity, and he's doing interviews. He was just on Joe Rogan for a very awkward conversation with Joe Rogan, where Joe Rogan was constantly bringing up, but what about the problems? What about the negativities of all of this technology? And Ray Kurzweil would just be like, oh, well, we can solve that. Oh, well, we can solve that. Oh, well, we can overcome that. Oh, well, it's going to be way better than you think. So this is like, if you don't want to listen to the podcast, that's basically what was said, But
yeah.
But in any case, with Ray Kurzweil's ideas, he is specifically making predictions based on the exponential capacities of our computational powers. And then moreover, his predictions are usually pretty good. So in other words, when Ray Kurzweil comes up with predictions about something technological, my assumption has always been better to listen than to not. When it comes to his more anthropological or philosophical or spiritual presuppositions, I've tended to the view that that's Ray Kurzweil's particular view and not necessarily connected to anything universal. So I want to make that distinction clear, because that distinction is the key to what I was motivated by in writing Global Brain Singularity. So what attracted me to the institute where I started writing Global Brain Singularity is known as CLEA, the Center for Leo Apostle, or otherwise known as the Center for Worldviews, is in Brussels, is in Belgium, and it's led by a cybernetician named Francis Heiligen, spelled Heylyghen. And if you Google him on Google Scholar especially, he has a huge scientific literature on the idea of the global brain. So if you put global brain, Francis Heiligen in Google Scholar, go have some fun, because it's a lot of really deep papers on this topic. And while there are other people who have contributed to the field, I don't think there's anyone who's contributed to the field more than him. So I would say, even go so far as to say, he's the founding father of that idea. And the reason why I wanted to do my doctoral thesis there, and the reason why I wanted to develop my ideas there, was because I saw a more holistic, let's say, point of view of singularity, which is not just looking at the power of exponential change in technology, but also interested in developing a deeper understanding of what this means for human beings in the broadest sense. I was always obsessed with, but what does this mean for the future of politics? What does this mean for the future of love? What does this mean for the future of education? Like very practical things. Like I thought, like I bought the idea in terms of the future of technology thing. Like I didn't think about it in a moralistic way. I just thought about it as, this is probably going to happen way. And I think that assumption through life has served me well, because I've been thinking like this since 2005. And now I see the discourse is completely changed, and our world is completely changed because of this technology, because of artificial intelligence, now because of large language models, which Kurzweil was predicting back in 2005. His prediction of 2029 was that we would have an AI that was going to be able to speak to us in a way that's indistinguishable from another human. And that seems to be like a correct prediction. Like that seems like it's going to happen. Like, and that's why I also like the movie Her. In the movie Her, you get this brilliant dramatization of what if we did have a personal assistant as a large language model that was able to speak to you like a girlfriend or a boyfriend. And then people start falling in love with these things. Like in 10 years, is that not possible that people will start talking to these things in ways that, like right now, everyone's on ChatGPT and Midjourney and things like that. But people weren't on ChatGPT and Midjourney 5 years ago. And so, like, we have to start thinking about it in this way. Like, what you think is absurd now might just be taken for granted as an a priori assumption 10 years from now, and might just be the normal way we live, right? Like, so it's quite transformative. In any case, the reason why I was attracted to study at the Global Brain Singularity with the global brain idea was because it gave me more room for theorization. It gave me more room to think about the consequences of all this technology for human beings. And so I was motivated by that. And I think that's, again, where I sort of, in my free study, in my research, I found the necessity of philosophy. And so then you see the beginning of my thesis, I'm thinking in evolutionary terms. At the beginning of my thesis, I'm trying to frame the evolution of the human system in regards to these metasystem transitions where we're going towards a new metasystem. And then at the end of my thesis, I just explode into philosophy, basically.
Yeah, I want to add something that you include in the book. It's 3 metaphorical conceptions of the global brain. So one of them was encyclopedism. So basically an entity with all world knowledge organized, accessible to all humans. Another one was organicism, which is humanity as a superorganism in the process of building a technological nervous system. And then emergentism, which is globalization as in the process of producing an emergent global consciousness. So these are all ways of how we could potentially think of a global brain singularity, which is all, it's something that's difficult to wrap your mind around. But these kind of metaphors help us kind of understand what you're getting at with this.
That's actually an idea that I was deriving from Francis Heiligen's work. So credit to him for that paper. He has a paper where he's developing those metaphors, and I definitely found that useful and incorporated that into my thesis as well. And when it comes to encyclopedism, I mean, really, we're already kind of there. Like, we kind of already have like all world knowledge accessible at like the click of a button almost, like the number of world historical books that you can just find if you just search them on Google and press PDF behind it. Or like if you have access to Library Genesis, like you can find almost everything now. And that's actually mind blowing that you have access like that like people paid thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars to be able to have access to university libraries. Like people made decisions about their life 50 years ago based on whether or not they, like, I was just listening to an interview with Camille Paglia where she said that she chose the university she chose because of the library she would have access to. Like that's inconceivable that we would make that decision now, because you already have it just sitting at home in your underwear playing around on Google. So we already kind of have the encyclopedic dimension to it. In terms of the organism or organic dimension of the human superorganism, I think that's way more complex, because then you're dealing with like, does the human species actually function like a unified organism? And I don't actually think the human species will ever be like a harmonious whole. And even if you look at an organism, like, it will just, if you take your own body as an organism, your own body is also at war with itself, and your own body can also go to war with itself, and we just call that cancer, right? Or something like that. So the organic view of the human superorganism, what's actual about that now is that anything that happens in China, or anything that happens in Africa, or anything that happens in South America or wherever, could have a global consequence on the whole organism, right? So like we already saw that with coronavirus, right? Where something that happened in China immediately spread to the whole planet, right? Or if we have some crisis in economy, like in 2008, it spreads to the whole planet. right? Like the whole, like, because like we are objectively one system in a weird way now, in a way that we definitely weren't 150 years ago. Like people underestimate, like this is always mind blowing to me, that the scramble for Africa was at the end of the 19th century. Most of Africa was not integrated into the world economic system 100 years ago. Like that's very recent. But now we're definitely all basically interconnected and increasingly so. And then you're going to have, like, that's objective, but then you'll have political reactions to this, right? Like you could even situate micro political moments like Trump or Brexit or different phenomena like this as reactions to interconnected to the whole world, like where people are like, no, let's go back to national thinking, let's close the borders, let's make immigration a major issue, right? Like and so like those are reactions to, oh crap, like we're all way closer than we used to be, and like it's all of a sudden, like it's quite recent. So it's like we don't know how to politically make sense of these things. So like that's what was motivating me to write Global Brain Singularity was, well, I knew this is going to have huge political consequences. This is going to have huge economic consequences. And then in regards to emergentism, globalization is at one point in time, like I just finished teaching the Philosophy of Right course on Hegel. And that's basically Hegel's theory of the state. And that was revolutionary at his time, because if at the time of publication, the whole planet was not covered by nation states. Like the whole planet became covered by nation states. And now the whole planet is covered by nation states, right? So they emerged and spread. But now we have a new crisis of politics where we have the crisis of the nation state. And we have the crisis of international organizations and international finance and how to regulate it all globally, right? Where we don't know what the answer to those issues are, right? Like the most famous example would be Thomas Piketty, the economist, wrote a book called Capital in the 21st Century. And he's saying, look, global wealth is getting out of control. And the ideal solution would be to propose a global wealth tax. But then the issue is, well, how are you going to do that? There's no way to do that. No one knows how to do that. And there's no pathway to do that. So you're pointing out the problem, but you're not really pointing out the actual mechanism by which that could happen. And so it hasn't been done. So just trying to say here that there's huge problems with the emergence of globalization, that we actually don't know how to think it yet. And so that's another thing that I was trying to point towards in specifically the paper about the global commons.
Yeah. So that's actually one of my favorite. You're calling them, I guess, every single chapter is a paper. Is that right?
Yeah.
Because I'm thinking of them like chapters. So
they are chapters. Yeah.
Yeah. So for me, I think that was chapter 7, and it was titled "A Global Commons and the Global Brain." Really enjoyed that one. In it, you speak about the limitations of capitalism and communism, and also you propose communism and what you call a global commons. Can you kind of speak to how these ideas intersect? What is a global commons? How would something like that even be possible? What do you believe are some of the biggest barriers to that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, like I said, one of the dimensions that first attracted me to Zizek was understanding his situation within the end of the Cold War. And so in the 20th century, at the end of the 20th century, I think, and for people in our generation, we underestimate the degree to which geopolitics was much more of a question in the 20th century, meaning that there was real geopolitical tensions about world system building, right? Like and that's the Cold War, right? Like the Cold War was about geopolitical tensions and world system building. And they were fighting over what developing countries would develop what system. Like, are we going to win South Asia, or are we going to win Southern Africa towards the communist effort or the capitalist effort? right? And now that fell apart. And now it's sort of like capitalism's the main way to go. And even Russia and China are now seen mostly as capitalist in their structure, even if they're not neoliberal as political entities. They're certainly not neoliberal. Western Europe, let's say the Eurozone, as well as North America, is neoliberal basically in its political orientation, but China and Russia aren't. And so there are sort of tensions. But I do think we're reapproaching the dimension of geopolitical tensions again, like whether it's the tensions with Israel and Palestine or whether it's the tensions with Russia and Ukraine. I do think that the idea that we are all in the shared political model is now untenable way of thinking. And I think that we should prepare ourselves for more geopolitical tensions as the century continues to unfold. In regards to the idea of communism, it's making us, usually I think revolutions are occurred by making very small differences. Like very small differences can have a big consequence. So like the best example is like the way of thinking about evolution or the way of thinking about gravity. Like the big changes that Darwin and Einstein made were actually very small differences. Like with Einstein, it was like the difference between flat and curved spacetime, right? Like, and the difference between flat and curved spacetime actually had a huge consequence because all of a sudden you've got black holes, right? Like that wasn't possible before. Or all of a sudden you've got the beginning of the universe. Like that wasn't possible before, right? So these small differences can have a big consequence. And so like the idea behind communism is that can have a big difference with the word communism. And the reason, the accent, the emphasis that I want to stress there is that I'm kind of against thinking in overly communitarian terms. I think that it puts too much stress on the human being to idealize our selfless integration into community. I'm not against community, obviously, and I'm not against thinking in those ways. But I think that when we idealize the human form towards community, and especially undialectically, it can lead to catastrophes. And I think we saw that in Russia and in China in the 20th century, where the commune projects were an objective disaster. So I'm not advocating for us to return to communes. But what I am advocating, here's what I am advocating. I am advocating that we start to think about global negativities that we all share. And until we start thinking about global negativities that we all share in common, then we won't be able to come up with the political structures that will be required to solve those problems. So I think there's various dimensions of the common. So there's a figure that I have in that paper where I outline the different dimensions of the commons.
Can you explain what the commons is? Because that's also a concept not everybody might understand.
So the commons is, well, first, Elinor Ostrom is the pioneer of the concept of the commons, and she actually won a Nobel Prize for her idea of the commons, and also more importantly, her anthropological work on the commons. It's basically trying to address the problems of things that we share. How do we politically manage things that we objectively share in common? Right? So like you could think like, say for example, there's a region of the planet that's undergoing a water crisis or a water shortage, right? Like that would, and if there was a global water issue, right? Like that would be a common problem. That would be a commons problem. And now you could come up with solutions to that, like desalinated water. Like there's technologies where we're trying to develop the capacity to desalinate water so that we could just convert salt water to fresh water, for example. Right? And that would be like a type of technological solution to water crises or something like that. I'm just trying to say that a commons, like coronavirus was a commons problem, right? Because it was affecting us all. It's something that it's either a resource or a tension or a problem that is in common. So it's more focusing on resources and problems as opposed to communities, right? So it's less trying to utopianize or idealize a certain communal form. And it's more trying to think about what political responses are possible given the problem we all have in common. Right? So now this is very difficult because, like, take, for example, global warming. Like, you could easily say global warming is a common problem. And I framed that as a common problem in the paper. But you can also have people who say global warming is a myth, or you could also have people that say global warming is the problems associated with global warming are used as a political football. Right? So you can also have disagreement about common problems, and that's part of the whole problem of the paradigm of the commons. Because you need to agree that it is a common problem before it's something that can be politically acted upon. Right? So, for example, even with coronavirus, we saw that. And so there's a lot of diversity with the commons, because if you take, for example, the coronavirus issue, different nation states had different responses to coronavirus. Like, China had a different response than Sweden, to use the most extreme opposites, where Sweden just didn't care in a way. And China was, like, doing things that a liberal society would see as totalitarian. Right? So it's more right now, the commons for me as a concept that is, I think, useful for speculative thinking about the future of politics. And the wager of the commons is that that's going to become an increasingly useful concept. Because I don't think I think global problems in the 21st century, there's going to be more things that we all share in common as the 21st century increases in terms of problems. And those could be social. Those could be like sexual or familial. Those could be immigration related. Those could be ecological, biological, like viruses and pathogens and bacterias, or even genetic engineering. Like what if China starts genetically engineering babies? Right? Like, that, all of a sudden that becomes a common problem. Right? These things are also, so there's also technology. Like, what about, like, mass automation? Like, what if in 10 years we don't need drivers anymore? What if in 10 years we don't need manufacturers anymore? What if in 10 years 3D printing houses is normalized? Like all of these things become common problems because they change the foundation of the way we do civilization. Right? And then, or what about production, like Amazon factories that don't need workers? Right? And then you've got someone making trillions of dollars and then no need for labor. And so the entire class conflict division that Marx is pointing out falls apart, because Marx's theory depended on workers having some stakes in the tension. But if you have mass automation, then that tension disappears, right? But the inequality grows. So these are all sort of, different examples of commons problems.
Yeah, I mean, just feeling into that is crazy, how we're so interconnected that, like you said, like China, engineering babies, well, that's going to impact us, because, like, what are they doing? Like, are they making them super, like, are they modifying them and making them, like, superhuman? And now they're capable of doing things we can't do. And now, it just, yeah, it's
well, if you can start selecting for genetic traits, and if you can start exaggerating certain genetic traits, and then if you get really good about that, now there's a whole bunch of problems with genetic engineering. I'm not saying that this is around the corner, and I'm saying that, like, this is something that I'm more thinking on the scale of, let's say, the 21st century. Like, I don't know when I'm not predicting when it's going to happen, but I'm saying the technology, like, for example, CRISPR technology, like, that's actually here. And CRISPR tech, if you look up George Church and CRISPR, CRISPR, then you'll find all the literature about it. But it's like, it is already actual. And so the fact that it's already actual, meaning that we can already start to play around with basically genetic selection, it would suggest that as we get better at doing this and as we learn more about this, that we could start to play around with the human form itself. And now there's a part of me that's like, well, that's really interesting. Like, that's cool, like like that, like, and like, so I'm not like, I'm not a Luddite, but I'm also not a utopianist, because, well, there's huge problems with every technology. There's also huge problems. And then that goes back to the origin of technology, because, there's technology has always produced a mixed bag in terms of ethics. So ethics will become more and more important.
Yeah, and we can't agree on a lot of ethical stuff now, and what technology is just making it more complex.
Absolutely. But here's the thing though, like, humans have always intensely disagreed. Like if you take, like, I've been studying more and more lately the religious wars in Europe in the last 1,000 years. Like the different wars we had, like specifically interested with the wars that broke out around Protestantism and Catholicism. Like, we will kill each other over fucking really small differences. So like so it's not like, oh, like technology is more complex, so now we disagree. Like, we've always disagreed intensely and like would kill each other over these differences. But technology confronts us with types of differences that we've never really been able to, we were never able to think before, because they weren't concrete.
Yeah, I'm curious. You speak about the fourth industrial revolution, which is basically driven by advances in AI and nanotechnology and biotechnology. What are some predictions that you have on how these technological trends will impact and change life? Or what are some of maybe the interesting predictions you've heard also?
Yeah, so for me, I tend away from prediction. Like, so one of the interesting things about Hegel, so like this is another interesting thing about Hegel's philosophy, why I started to gravitate towards it, is that Hegel has this metaphor of the owl of Minerva takes flight at dusk, which is why the symbol of Philosophy Portal is the owl. And the meaning of that symbol and the meaning of the owl of Minerva as a metaphor is basically, like, I would say, a symbol of wisdom, that you cannot jump ahead of yourself into the future, that you can't actually know what the future actually will be. You have to kind of reconcile yourself with the present in order to think the future as it unfolds. That's how I understand it. So I've become less sort of preoccupied with, will we have fully automated cars in 2035? Or, or will we have like fully automated factories in the next 10 years or something? But I am like sort of paying attention to broad trends and processes, just to more anticipate what might be happening. Like, and I'm even using that to, like, say, for example, build Philosophy Portal, because I think it's a different form of education than in the universities. And that's possible because of new technologies that have become available in the last 10 years that I couldn't have built Philosophy Portal with without paying attention to those trends and being aware of the direction of these processes. But I think that I mean, I'm not saying anything that's here you couldn't find anywhere else, really, which is that I really think that our entire relationship to work is going to have to change. And I think this is being technologically driven. And I think that any of the identities that people use to build a life and support a family are going to become disturbed, perturbed by these technological processes. And I think what we're dealing with now, and a lot of the political problems that we're dealing with now, are a result of heightened global competition in the workplace. One, as a result of the economy being global, but also because technologies are making redundant a lot of things that humans used to be necessary for. And so we have to constantly reinvent ourselves. And there's something good about that, but there's also something alienating and enslaving about that. So my personal ideas around this are we need to rethink property and we need to rethink the social contract. So, like, for example, I've always been sort of left-leaning politically, but I've also kind of been alienated and disappointed with the direction of leftist politics, especially in the last 10 years. And we could go into why leftist politics has taken the direction that it has. But one of the biggest economic policies that leftists usually propose is something like basic income. I don't know if that's a good idea. I'm not against it. But I don't think it goes deep enough. I don't think it's a deep enough solution. And so for me, again, where I go is I think we need to rethink property fundamentally. And of course you could get scared when I say that, because you could say, well, are you a Marxist? Like, are you saying we should abolish I'm not saying we should abolish property, right? I think we need to rethink property. I think we have huge housing crises. I think we have huge renting issues. And I think that we have also the issue of a lot of property is like, for example, in major cities is either it's too expensive for anyone to live there, or people are buying up large blocks of property and no one's living there, right? And the whole market dynamics of housing is messed up, and I think we need to rethink that fundamentally. And I do think that it's possible for us to have a different relationship to property, where we could have a system which supported, say, easier access for. Basically, there's going to be a huge change when the boomers die. There's a lot of wealth and property caught up in an undialectical, non-generational relationship to the next generation. And so there are a lot of people who can't afford to buy homes. There are a lot of people who can't afford to live in a house where they could support having a family. So people are having families later, marriages are declining, or people are less confident in their capacity to build and support a family. So we need to think about property, I think, there. And we also need to think about social contract. Like, social contract is a big dimension where, for example, after the Great Depression in the 1920s and 1930s, there was a new relationship and the birth of the welfare state, which was basically a new social contract. And I think that the ideas around basic income are pointing in that direction, but I think it's just too simple of an idea at the moment.
Yeah, I really appreciate how this conversation kind of like zooms out, zooms in, like we're taking these different views, and I want to zoom out a little bit more on something that your work explores, and that's the relationship between subjectivity and objectivity. And that's a big question in philosophy. And you propose something called non-monism. Can you explain what non-monism means? How is that different than non-duality? I'm trying to understand how you're thinking about that.
Right. So non-duality. So you correct me if I'm wrong on non-duality. Okay. So the way I understand non-duality is that it's ultimately pointing towards, it's not the subject, it's not the object, but so it's not the dualistic understanding, but that there's a certain ineffable oneness that we can have some sort of mystical relationship to, but that is not found in opposition. It's not found in contradiction. It's not found in the two, but found in, say, the ineffable one. That's my understanding of non-duality. Now, non-monism is proposing something a little bit different. And the reason why I'm developing the idea of non-monism is because I'm looking for a metaphysics that I think could be useful for both, let's say, libidinal and political realities. So it's literally an attempt at a metaphysics for libidinal and political realities. And what it means is it's the not one. The non-monism just means not one. And not what that means, not one practically speaking, is that I think that we are constantly searching for the one. We're constantly searching for unity, but we just kind of find the impossibility of unity. And we have to work with, and we have to see that as positive, basically. We have to see the impossibility of unity as a positive thing. And we have to think about that on a libidinal level and a political level, right? And I think that that actually metaphysically describes the nature of families. I think that describes metaphysically the nature of political states. I'm not sort of convinced that I'm not trying to propose this as like the ultimate metaphysics, but it is an attempt to think through the impossibility of our desire for unity.
Yeah, I guess I'll kind of word this a little bit maybe differently too, but this is related to this question. So like in my own life, I've been very interested in Buddhist philosophy and practice. And, I want to understand a little more where your philosophy diverges from Buddhist thinking or your understanding of Buddhism. And, I believe you said that in your understanding, Buddhism undermines appearances and sees them all as illusory and as something to transcend. Whereas you're thinking, as in Plato's appearances, there's a truth in them. Can you kind of expand on how you're thinking about that?
Now, of course, it's easy to make a straw man of any spiritual or religious orientation. And of course, you'll find Buddhists who would push back on that distinction or not. But let me just speak to it from my experience and relationship to it, which is, so like, for example, when you go to a Buddhist, like I went to, for example, a Buddhist temple before. It's Thich Nhat Hanh's Buddhist temple in the south of France.
Yeah, Plum Village.
I've been to Plum Village.
Very cool.
I've explored that, and I've talked to, for example, monks and things like that. There's a way in which the Buddhist philosophy lends itself to a meditative inner withdrawal, and also a type of skepticism and distance with language and concepts. So, like, for example, when I went to the urinal at Plum Village, the sign they had over the urinal was "Concepts are just in your mind," which is basically to say, like, that concepts are illusory and it's not sort of the true nature of your mind or something like that. Like, there's not a real to them. So I'm not trying to go against Buddhist philosophy either, but I'm just saying that when I spoke to some of the monks, what I was interested in is why they became monks. And most of the monks responded to me with some sort of affective difficulty. Like, one monk said, like, he had like a really bad breakup with someone and he couldn't go on not being with that person. Right. And so he chose to live a life of celibacy and withdrawal at the monastery, which I'm just trying to get at. This dimension of non-monism is that we need to struggle with and we need to tarry with this impossibility of unity in the world. I think whatever spiritual orientation that you have, I don't care. The main thing I'm interested in is whether or not we have the capacity to not only go into a meditative withdrawal, but also go back into the world and really struggle with sexual and political realities where families are born and where businesses are made and where we engage with life. So I don't like, of course, I'm sure there are resources in Buddhism for this. So I'm not trying to go against that, but I'm just saying that that's my effort there.
Yeah. So I think you kind of understand this already, but yeah, basically like that version of Buddhism, like becoming a monk, this is something I learned fairly recently that was, very helpful for me. And there's basically like a sutric view, which is renunciate. It's like you kind of renounce the world and, you renounce appearances. They're just illusory and there's nothing in them. Whereas there's a view that's a tantric view is you actually play with appearances and you don't see them as ultimately real, but you see them as useful and necessary, and you don't try to get away from them, but you engage with them. And I think that's basically what you're saying.
That is what I'm saying. So like the distinction, so like in my own intellectual circles, like the distinction between Tantra and Sutra, is a major one. And actually this month at the Portal, we're going to have a real talk that's titled Tantric Life. And so we are thinking about tantric life, and there's many thinkers that I work with. Actually, next week in the Portal, there's someone who is an expert and a practitioner in an organization called the New Tantra, which is an organization that's working with sexual energy. So I'm just here. Yeah, to me, I don't want to get caught up in East West or Christianity and Buddhism. I'm more interested in and like there are forms of Christianity that are based around withdrawing from the world.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
Seeing sexuality as negative, right? And I'm sort of against that motion too. I'm just saying that we have to affirm life motion, and that the truth and the appearances are more connected than we think. And that goes back to the distinction I was trying to make to you before with Lacan's idea that the truth has the structure of a fiction. The truth has the structure of the fiction is trying to get at this idea that actually fiction is not opposed to truth, that fiction is how we explore deeper levels of truth. Like, so giving the example of like, if you watch like a really good Netflix program and you're really paying attention, like you could actually learn something about yourself and the truth of your process through that fiction.
Yeah, I love how all these pieces are coming together in your philosophy and your work and everything you're doing. I guess there's a question I have that's, I feel like a lot of people are kind of thinking about this now, and this seems to be something that's happening. And this notion of Christian conversions. This seems to be a big topic and a thing that's happening. How are you making sense of this?
Yeah, no, it's a huge one. And actually, I haven't announced it yet, but the next course at Philosophy Portal is going to be titled Christian Atheism. And it's going to be my attempt to engage with this historical phenomena. And it's inspired by Zizek, whose latest book is titled Christian Atheism. So there's a tradition of this idea as well. But no, conversions are happening. Christian conversions are happening. And the way I think about this is that I basically have the model in my mind of Hegel's phenomenology of spirit. So in Hegel's phenomenology of spirit, he articulates a series of historical forms that unfold within every individual and collective life. And those forms are consciousness, self-consciousness, reason, spirit, religion, and absolute knowing. And so those forms comprise the phenomenology of spirit. And the way I'm thinking about it is that our society, since the beginning of this century, has been moving through the phenomenology of spirit and trying to figure out the truth of form for our century. So I think in the early 2000s, I think we were trying to do it through reason. And I think that that's sort of evident in sort of like figures like Richard Dawkins, who founded like an institute like the Institute for Reason and Science. And this idea that reason and science could get rid of spirituality and religion. And then this sort of fell apart. And I think that in the 2010s, we were more moving into spirituality, meaning a movement towards, let's say, I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious. Right? And that was becoming a dominant form. And we were exploring meditation, we were exploring psychedelics, we were exploring the inner world, we were exploring inner rituals, we're exploring that dimension of spirit. But what we were saying about religion was more about the antagonism with like the social institutional body, which we had a negative relationship to. And now I think we're in the religious phase, where people are seeing the limitations of spirit, and you'll even have people like Peter Thiel say things like, I'm religious, but I'm not spiritual. So they're inverting it, right? And they're going more into religion. I'm not so sure, but here's what I can't figure out about it. I'm not sure how much of it is LARPing. Like I'm not sure how much of the religious identity thing is LARPing with religious identity or like just watching YouTube videos too much, and how much of it is actually like people going back to church. Because when you look at the data, I'm not sure if like church attendance is rising or not. I'm not sure, but like that to me like would be the concrete dimension of it. Like is like, are we actually going back to religion, or is it kind of like a virtual symptom? That to me is my question for this moment. And I have other questions about it, because actually if you look at like data on religion, religions do not grow by conversion. Religions grow by birth. Right? So the question is not if guys in their 20s are converting from watching YouTube videos, but the question is rather, are those guys who are converting watching YouTube videos actually going to church and starting families? And are those children going to be retained by the religious institution or not? Right? So it's a much more difficult question. Right? And so like that's my question but I do think our society is trying to process religion. And I think that's like we're trying to figure that out. My personal view is maybe similar to your own, is that I think capitalism's religion. Like I think that actually the proper way to think about religion today is as what's actually moving society universally on the level of virtual motion. And I think that's capital. And I think capital has transcended like Hegel thought the state was God. But like, and maybe the state was God for a moment. But now the state is in capital. No, sorry, now God is in capital. Like maybe God was in the state when Hegel was writing. But now God is in capital. So now I think it's moved actually. So I actually think the real religious struggle is paradoxically elsewhere than where people think it is. Because people think it's maybe in, again, like the Christian myths or something, which I think, again, can help, but I don't think it's actually where God is at the moment. Like, I think God is somewhere else. But then I think that there's another stage we have to go, which is what Hegel calls absolute knowing, which actually, it breaks open through religion. So once you tarry with where God is, then you actually know God or something like that. So I think that something like religious people, like if you're contained by a religion, like this is the weird paradox I'm trying to think, is like, if you're contained by religion, could that even be a buffer against God? Like it's like, actually God's too terrifying to know directly. So like religion's like a buffer, like to keep you safe from God. Because like if you actually confront God, it's too terrifying to bear, or something like that. There's all sorts of weird things I could say there, but what I'm trying to say is that, and this is what I'm hoping to get in the Christian atheism course, is that there's some tension between religion and absolute knowing that I think we're going to have to break open to. And I think that it's being implicitly wrestled with by people who are secular atheists, who are realizing that Christianity has something of relevance to say to them about their life. Like, I'm interested in the people who are dancing in that tension, but I think what it's pointing towards is a different form of knowing that hasn't been birthed yet on a social level.
Yeah, I mean, this whole question of religion and what religion actually is so fascinating. Like I've been diving into that, and there's a book that I really recommend. It's the religious case against belief by James Carse, and in there he basically says that religion is something that nobody can even really define, but we can, in some way, we still figure out how to talk about it. And he kind of distinguishes the difference between belief systems and religion, which is fascinating. But yeah, I'm just exploring that a lot. And I find it interesting how so many people have a very limited understanding of what religion is and just kind of see it as completely negative and somehow think that they're free of it. And that comes back to the whole notion of, capitalism, religion. You think you're free of, well, no, you're embedded in this system of neoliberal capitalism. That's your religion right there. So it's just fascinating how just, yeah, religion is very
This
fascinating.
is the unconscious to me.
Mm.
Like what you're just saying right there. That's to me like the active, like that's the active unconscious.
Yeah, and I think that's how Jung was thinking about it too, and that's how he thought about religion. And a lot of that is informed by Peterson, and like that, I think that was the person who made me change my mind. Of like seeing religion as like this negative thing, or as something that I understood as like this closed system of beliefs, and then reading like Maps of Meaning and like, whoa, like I don't get this. Like I don't get this. This is far more complex and intriguing and intertwined with everything than I thought. So
The
yeah,
main thing, and this goes to your book, The Religious Case Against Belief,
yeah,
like what Peterson, I think what's trying to get at in the Maps of Meaning book, like right from the beginning, is basically what people consciously directly identify with as their belief is not what they believe. Like the belief is more in their action, like it's what they're acting out. So like in this dimension of like the religion is the neoliberal capitalism, you could say I'm not religious, but then you could say, well, you go 9 to 5 to this job you hate every day,
yeah.
right? So like that is your religion.
Unconscious. Yep, yep. It's fascinating. So maybe I'll ask one more question, and you've touched on it a little bit about Philosophy Portal, but just kind of curious. What is your vision for this platform? What are you hoping to achieve with it? Maybe you could speak a little bit more to that and kind of just invite some people into that are listening to this.
So originally, Philosophy Portal started under the idea that we need to relearn the foundational texts of the modern world. And the reason why that I think is important is because we grew up in an era of deconstructive philosophy. And deconstructive philosophy is great, but if you don't know what you're deconstructing, then it becomes a dangerous weapon. So I think that we need to learn the foundational modern texts, and then it actually makes our deconstruction more robust. It actually makes it deeper if you actually know what you're deconstructing. And I could give practical examples with that, like I just did in the Philosophy of Right. Like I said, well, Hegel thought God was in the state. Well, maybe God is in capital. Like I'm in some way deconstructing Hegel, but like it's coming from an informed deep reading. So it's this is what I'm trying to cultivate in the discourse, and that's I think the culture that's emerging at Philosophy Portal is around that. And then I have also built out what I call the Portal, which is an extension of Philosophy Portal, which is a live event space where we hold 4 live events every month, which are organized around a single theme for the month. The organization of the event space as a whole unfolds as like a triad of we repeat meta themes of sex, community, and metaphysics every 3 months. And each of the 4 different events is designed to offer a different window into making philosophy actual. So it's not just reading the old texts. You like reading the old text is important, but also creating spaces for philosophy to become alive now is also important. And so that's what the live event space is trying to serve. Concept Cave is to build concepts. The Edge is to explore unconceptualized territory. Thought Lab is to learn with contemporary thought leaders. And Real Talk is to open up a personal sharing circle. And so all together, like that's sort of like each month's unfolding. And yeah, I'm just trying to participate in the larger conversation and make philosophy alive for the present moment, because I think it's more and more necessary, because reality is more and more complex, more and more uncertain. All of the things that are going on at the frontier of science are related to complexity and uncertainty and chaos. And I think that the proper philosophical response to that is to raise ourselves to the challenge of being the types of thinkers that can inhabit complexity and uncertainty and chaos and actually produce gems and diamonds from that encounter.
Yeah, I really appreciate this idea that you kind of are building Philosophy Portal on, is that we need to understand modern thinking and modern thought before we deconstruct it. This is like one of the huge problems that I see is like everybody has an opinion, everybody wants to critique everything, but how many of those opinions are informed? how much of that is people actually trying to educate themselves and inform them on things? Everybody wants to speak on things and tear things down. Oh, truth is relative. Everything's like, that's the postmodern ethos. And it's like, no, it's like, let's understand what we're deconstructing first and really appreciate that.
Like take for example, like there's so many people to me who have political ideas that are anti-state at their fundamental ground. But do you really know like the fundamental theories of what the state is? Like, do you know what you're deconstruct? Do you know what you're deconstruct? Like the most ridiculous examples, like people who, like for example, there was those people who wanted to completely abolish the police. I forget if it was in different areas of America. I don't know if it was in Portland or Seattle or somewhere else, or Minnesota even, where they wanted to just get rid of the police. But then immediately there were gangs that came up and popped up to replace the police. Like, do you know what you're deconstructing? Like you have to know what you're deconstructing first, right? Like, and then you can actually make a real change. But if you don't know what you're deconstructing, then you're never going to make a real change.
Makes sense. Cadell, this has been a fascinating conversation. You know, we spoke about your ideas in global brain singularity, explored Plato, Hegel, Lacan, Zizek, Jordan Peterson, spoke about the global commons and, just some of the things that may be happening in the future. And just explored non-monism, just so many different things. I really appreciate the wealth of knowledge and the different perspectives that you bring. It's been kind of very expansive for me to engage with your book and what you're thinking. Is there anything that you want to share before we wrap up? Anything else?
Sure. I mean, I always say that I will share my PDF of Global Brain Singularity with anyone who's interested because Springer charges too much for it. I will, but I also have other books which are self-published, which are more reasonably priced. So I also published last year Systems and Subjects, which is a book that is exploring the dialectical conversation between continental philosophy and system science or interdisciplinary science. So I'm trying to put continental philosophy and interdisciplinary science into a conversation. And so if you're interested in that, that's in Systems and Subjects. And also Philosophy Portal produces anthologies. And we've produced 2 anthologies so far, and the third one's coming out very soon. And those are collective works by the community at Philosophy Portal. So if you're interested in learning from the community mind at Philosophy Portal, those anthologies are the place to go. And those are the result of people who are deeply reading the fundamental texts of the modern world. And then Philosophy Portal itself offers courses. We host conferences and produce anthologies, and we also have the live event space. So you can find all of that at philosophyportal.online.
Cadell, thank you so much. Appreciate you.
My pleasure.